Today we're joined by Thomas. He's a PhD candidate at the University of St Andrews in IR and researching conflict and smuggling in North Africa. Thomas, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, man, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, perhaps let's start with sort of a brief overview of your research and perhaps what got you into it.
Yeah, so as you said, my research sort of looks at the relationship between conflict and smuggling in North Africa, particularly in Mali. Um, it's a very complex relationship that we can get into later in the conversation. But sort of what drove me to the topic probably goes back to, well, it does go back to 2015 when I was doing a master's degree. And it's long enough ago now where I have to ask people like if they remember it, but because I know it was like what 7 years ago. Um, and that was the time 2016 when the big European migrant crisis happened. When the Syrian civil war was really popping off, and that related to the migrant crisis, the Mediterranean migrant crisis that really dominated the news at the time. If you remember, I know you were a young teen, but it was the biggest thing. I mean, it was the sort of, I don't want to make like blasé comparisons, but it was like the Ukraine war of the time, like all these migrants showing up, these big migrant smuggling operations. So it was a big thing. So I was doing a political science master's degree at the time. So obviously the big things, the big sort of topical things were civil war, Syria, Libya, Arabs, the sort of fallout from the Arab Spring, and refugee migration flows. So when I was trying to figure out to do a thesis, I was naturally drawn to those sort of two things. And obviously a lot of people were doing research on the effect of conflict and wars on migration and refugee flows, which is sort of the normal directional arrow, right? Where you have civil war and you have refugees and that whole dynamic. But I saw a lot of people doing that, but I sort of got the idea to flip the causation arrow around and try to ask, how do these big migrations and the smuggling networks that facilitate them impact the conflict? How does it play back into the civil wars that either are initiating these movements or in neighboring civil wars? So it's really looking at the effects of the smuggling economy on war economies and conflict in general.
Right. So the focus is a lot more sort of internal to Africa rather than looking at the impacts perhaps on the West or other things.
Yeah, so it actually started more interested in the Levant, in Syria. My first guiding question, sort of suspicion, was looking at it from sort of an organized crime perspective. And again, these two sort of parallel headlines were animating the news together about ISIS, smuggling networks, refugees, conflict. And at the time of my master's degree, we were doing a lot of research or readings on a lot of the organized crime literature, and a lot of civil wars in the 90s that were seen to be driven by economic greed and shadow economies and like diamonds and stuff like that in Africa. So I was like, okay, so we have these huge smuggling networks, this huge smuggling economy. We've got literally billions of dollars running through Libya. How is this playing back into it? Do you have this, I'm thinking, if you got this situation where these armed groups that are protagonists in these wars, impelling these migrant movements, and they're actually profiting from their movements because they're taxing the smugglers. They're the smugglers themselves. They're getting money from these people who they're driving out across borders, who are having to pay smugglers to get them to safety. So I'm just like, it should be this whole racket.
Yeah.
Which I was looking for that. I was looking for that relationship of this is sort of like, again, just like a total like organized crime sort of conspiracy type thing of like these armed groups are actually profiting from these refugee flows, which is in turn doubling down on the conflict itself and making the conflict worse, which is then making the refugees flows worse. So it's just this terrible racket and this positive feedback loop that goes around and around and around. So that was the relationship I was looking for in Syria. So I was like, is ISIS doing this on purpose in some level to try to get refugees moving at certain quantities through certain border points, through certain areas that they can then tax, that they're even taxing them themselves at the border crossings. They're taxing and racketeering against the smuggling groups, getting payments and stuff like that. Um, and there is some evidence of that. So like you do find in some of the accounts of the time that ISIS was attacking certain migrant caravans, almost hurting them in a way, suspected with the suspected goal of pushing them through certain border crossings, certain areas that they had taxing powers over, just sort of
Right.
farm.
So it's sort of developing whole ecosystem around sort of the smuggling and conflict,
Yeah,
and sort of being able to take advantage of that.
yeah, exactly. So that's how the causation arrow turns around in the other direction. It's like we're not just asking how does conflict contribute to migration and refugee flows, but how do these migration and refugee flows through smuggling economies recontribute back to the conflict and this really insidious cycle?
Right. So it sort of began with that, and then you focused in on Mali a little bit. How did you
Yeah,
sort of
how did I
end
get
up
to
on
Mali?
looking at Mali? Yeah.
So, as I said, my first sort of focus was Syria because that was sort of the big area that where this was most intense. And obviously, the civil war in Syria was, the Ukraine war of today. At the time, it was just everywhere. So everyone was wanting to do research on it. I was in the middle of my master's degree, had to do a thesis, and just like talking through my ideas or what I just basically told you, my suspicions about Syria to my supervisor, and he was intrigued. But his very practical advice was just like, you don't want to do research on Syria right now because it's just so messy. And to try to like nail down certain dynamics, one or two factors, it's just like it's too complicated, it's too fast moving. Syria is just a bloody mess, literally and figuratively, of trying to do research on it, just because it's so complicated. So that sort of practical reasons made me pivot a bit towards North Africa, which was also an area I was interested in. I was suspecting there'd be a lot of the same dynamics in Libya, with the conflict and the migration there and the smuggling networks there, as well as Mali that was also having armed conflict happening, and it was also a major transit zone for a lot of migrant routes. So that's what I pivoted towards North Africa. I was like, okay, maybe these will be my case studies for practical reasons. And also there was a possibility of perhaps doing field work there, particularly in Mali. Whereas in Syria, that was absolutely off the table for security reasons. Libya to a similar extent. So that's just the honest answer. Sometimes it's just practicalities. It's I want to get on the ground and do some field research. That was sort of the main reason to sort of pivot to North Africa to try to find these dynamics. But also once I dove into it, I found like, oh, this is great. There's a lot of really great. I don't want to sound blasé about it because it's serious material, but there was a lot of interesting things happening in the research, and I could tell a lot of those types of stories, and do the types of analysis, and find those dynamics I was looking for in Syria in North Africa.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, perhaps it could be nice to zoom out a little bit on Mali more generally and sort of give a bit more context to sort of the conflicts that's been arising in Mali over sort of the past 2 decades, and sort of set the scene almost.
Yeah, that's good. So
within Mali, yeah.
So the sort of big picture, sort of political geography of Mali. I don't know if you'll have a map in your head. Is Mali is one of those countries in the middle of the Sahara Desert that basically the northern 2/3 of it is the Sahara Desert, and the 90+% of the population is in the south, which is basically sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a very interesting country geographically, culturally. It's very diverse. Like I said, it's like two separate countries, with the north being sparsely populated, desert population, mainly the Tuareg and Arabs. These are Arabs, and then sort of the Tuareg are sort of Berber, from the Berber family of peoples. Whereas in the south, which is where the capital is, where most of the economy is, most of the population is more what we think of as sub-Saharan Africa. So all the political power, all the economy, all the economic power is in the south. The capital's Bamako. Climatically, it's sort of sub-Saharan Africa. Again, this is sort of contrasted with the North, which is basically desert, ethnically different, linguistically different. So this has been sort of a fault line, sort of a political fault line, a social fault line within Mali that has been quite contentious, very contentious since Mali gained independence in the 1960s. There's been a series of northern rebellions or civil wars, whatever the sort of that's sort of the semantics, but a number of civil wars, rebellions of in the north against the south, trying to rectify a lot of grievances that they have with the power base down south. So there's been a series of those since the 60s. So there was one in the 60s, one in the 90s that was a big one. A couple incidents popped off in the mid 2000s. And then it really popped off in a severe way in 2012, which is, if you pay attention to what's happening in Mali now, is sort of the legacy of which is still sort of playing out.
Right. Yeah, and in 2012 it was sort of a big civil war between the North and South, right? How did that sort of play out in the end? Are they still sort of in heavy conflict now? I know they've reached sort of a peace agreement in 2015, but that's still sort of quite contentious. So what's sort of the vibe, if you like, nowadays?
Yeah,
Is it still...
so it's the vibe and the complexity comes in when you look at the dynamics within the North and within the groups that were rebelling. And this is the way it also played out in the 90s, is that they had sort of a cohesive, organized, unified movement at the outset that had a lot of quick victories, and that had the effect of drawing the Malian government to the negotiating table, mediated by some neighboring countries, Algeria mainly. So they had a peace agreement, right? But the problem is that initially cohesive, unified movement splintered quite quickly. It splintered across ethnic lines. It splintered within ethnic lines, so along sort of class issues between the Tuareg population and the Arab population. And then you had the effect also of, there was this other constellation of actors that came and got involved, which are jihadi groups that obviously had their own ideas for what the aims and strategies and demands should be within this conflict. So that's just added this other layer of complexity, and it's quite messy. And that's sort of what I try to get into in my research, is to make sense of this complexity and this messiness through the lens of what's happening in the smuggling economy, and how changes in the smuggling economy is sort of empowering certain groups over others and sort of destabilizing social hierarchies, and in a way that is, making peace and sort of political equilibrium in Mali very, very challenging at the moment.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a good segue to sort of get into a bit more of the smuggling route, and sort of more into your research, right? So, when you speak about smuggling, is this sort of smuggling of weapons, is it of sort of drugs, is it a sort of mix of everything? What's that dynamic like at the moment?
It is everything, but with my research, I sort of hone in on drug smuggling for reasons that I'll get into, because drug smuggling by its nature has been extremely socially destabilizing in the Sahara in general, and particularly through North Africa, North Mali, and the places that it's sort of transited to. That's because it's come into these smuggling networks that are very socially embedded, that have existed in the region for centuries, really, but really been sort of calcified for decades. And this is sort of the economy. They smuggle, everything from a lot of subsidized goods from North Africa to sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of just sort of regular staples, not really exciting, sexy stuff. But that's sort of the smuggling economy that's technically illicit, but not really. It's sort of what sustains the region. And again, it's very socially embedded. It's run by local tribes. These tribes have their own sort of social hierarchies that sort of keep this all in place. But what drug smuggling did in the 2000s mainly is when this happened, when this really came into North Africa from South America, is that when it came into these smuggling networks, it really disrupted a lot of these social hierarchies because of it. One of the reasons is that it was very small bulk, high value. So it's something that's easily sort of smuggleable without having to have a sort of broad cooperation across a long geographic span to get sort of accruing profits. So it came in and it sort of promoted a lot of opportunism, a lot of get rich quick paths for a lot of people who no longer had to go through these traditional social hierarchies and these traditional social networks in order to be a part of these smuggling economies.
So was that sort of quite a big flip in, say, the Mali smuggling ecosystem, where it sort of went from a more set up, structured sort of thing to a more concentrated sort of free for all?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm sort of arguing is like a huge story of what's happening, what's contributed to why Mali's such a mess right now, is that the social fabric has just disintegrated.
And was that also, I know we spoke about this previously, but was that sort of more focused on North Mali, sort of that level of drug smuggling? So does that play into it as well, the North-South dynamic, or?
Yeah. So primarily, there's a number of different ways that, and again, this is hard to sort of know 100% because that's just the nature of illicit clandestine industries, but a lot of it would come up through the ports in West Africa. So it would transit through the south up into the north, or from neighboring countries up into the north. Also, it would come in by plane and just land in the desert across from the Atlantic. So sort of like a direct entry point there. So how does that affect North-South dynamics? Again, because of the fact that it has to go through a lot of borders, it did come through the south, through the west ports. And just by the nature of it, required some sort of level of government involvement, government collusion. So that brought the government in the south involved in this game. And how this contributed to what happened in the north is that because the government sort of needs to act as sort of a gatekeeper here for this industry to thrive, is that they have been able to sort of opportunistically choose winners and losers in the north, of which groups were going to be sort of who they would turn a blind eye to, who they would cooperate with, these corrupt officials, to allow these goods to transit. So what they did is that they looked to the traditionally subservient social classes in this area that they wanted to sort of use a divide and conquer strategy against the north, right? Because it's always rebelling, so they're sort of having to sort of play that sort of shoestring game with them. So what they did is they've allowed these sort of subservient, traditionally marginalized communities at the bottom of the social hierarchies benefit and accrue a lot of wealth from this industry, which has had the effect of, yes, overturning a lot of social, political systems in the north, which is kind of what the intention was, because it was the sort of prevailing power structures of the north that were constantly rebelling against the south. So that was sort of the idea. But maybe that has a bit of an unintended consequence in that now that they're trying to stitch the north back together and sort of refine the political equilibrium, it has not been able to happen because the whole thing has just been a mess.
Yeah. And so you speak quite a bit about sort of the social hierarchies being sort of overturned and changed quite a lot through these developments. Could you speak more about that in terms of, you also mentioned some local tribes. Are those just completely being overturned and overhauled into sort of a new social dynamic? Yeah, could you just speak a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this sort of, just to zoom out a minute onto like a bit more like theory stuff, and I'll try not to make it boring, but this the whole question when I asked myself, how does a resource affect a civil war? That's sort of a contentious question. How does a resource affect a civil war? Okay, so to what then? How does it affect an armed group's organization? How does it affect their behavior? Um,
Mm-hmm.
how does an economic change, their economic base change their structure, their cohesion, their degree to which they're centralized? And that has been um, a contested question because when the literature asks about, okay, well, what really drives an armed group, their organization, their cohesion? Do economic factors matter at all? Or that's one side of the debate says yes, they're absolutely decisive. And it's like that's mainly what armed groups are, is they're organized crime rackets. So it's
Mm-hmm.
highly impactful and very linear. Whereas the other side of the debate, like no, like economics really doesn't matter all that much in terms of their structure. It's actually just social bonds, the
Mm-hmm.
sort of the social bases that they draw from, sort of non-economic, non-material factors that contributes to an armed group's degree and type of organization and cohesion. Um, so, okay, that was a debate that I sort of looked at and see, okay, well, what is this case telling me?
Yeah.
Does this economic change, do these resources matter? Is it reflecting onto how these armed groups were organized, etc.? Um, and this is where the really interesting thing came, because when you look at the tribes, the social political structures of North Africa and the Sahara,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's an area where social structures and economic structures are incredibly intertwined and interlinked. So,
Right.
and this is a broader sort of fact of political economy, and we see it in our society, but particularly in the society, that those at the top of the social hierarchy are also at the top of the economic hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So traditionally, you're looking at the tribal leaders, the sort of hegemonic groups in North Africa and the Saharan spaces. They were, starting in the 60s, where these sort of systems, post-independent systems, really sort of were pieced together. These were people that traditionally were known for being masters of the camel and sort of
Mm-hmm.
traditional caravan trade leaders. There was also these sort of
Right.
social systems within the Tuareg and within the Arab that gave the nobles, as we could call them, of these societies, sort of privileged access to camels. So
Mm-hmm.
that's an economic function, because camels are incredibly important in the caravan trade and the economy. So that put them at the top. This sort of social privilege put them at the top of the economic hierarchy. So that's sort of
Right.
the social economic equilibrium that they had for independence up until the 90s, really, when this social control, this sort of social hierarchy began being stressed
Mm-hmm.
because of largely because changes in technology, like the introduction of 4x4s, jeeps, vehicles, cars that diminish the importance of camels in the sort of wider economy.
Mm-hmm.
So that by sort of diminishing the economic power, the economic role of these noble tribes, that had a corollary in the social realm. It sort of
Mm-hmm.
challenged um, their ability to maintain social control, and that was the dynamic that we saw in the Civil War of the 1990s, where the noble tribes that were really leading the conflict really struggled to maintain cohesion of the wider group, because I tie it back to changes that has happened in the economy, and they no longer have this material leverage.
Mm. But how come, Thomas? How come they didn't maintain the material leverage, say, even with the advent of technology? How come they still weren't able to sort of concentrate the resources at the top? Was it just because it was just more available, or?
So it's just a matter of certain economic changes, certain resources, just by their kind of nature, preclude an actor from being able to centralize them.
Mm.
That was partly the effect um, of vehicles coming in, and also you had GPS technology, right? So
Right.
what the sort of the really way that they maintained the power previously was that they sort of had this reputation of being great camel masters. They lived in a very strategic region where they, for generations and generations, have become known as the people that had, they knew the desert on like the back of their hand. So they had this local knowledge. They were in strategic areas of like border crossings, and they had this sort of social privilege of maintaining the camel. So once people were able to navigate these areas without the help of these noble tribes, because they had GPS, they don't need these local guides. They have cars. They don't need their camels. So that sort of flattened out the economic landscape. And once you get that disjointment between the sort of an economic hierarchy and a social hierarchy, it's almost, if you like use the analogy of like a tectonic plate, the social and economic plates are sort of like holding together, they're sort of aligned, but once they get misaligned, boom, you get quite a shock. And that's what I argue contributes to why these civil wars have popped off to this severe degree that they have. And so that's the story of the 90s with the cars and the GPS, and it was quite messy and socially destabilizing, and it was all that stuff. And not to get ahead, but the same sort of stuff happened in 2012 because of a lot of the economic changes that happened in the 2000s with drugs.
I'm sorry. I'm also sort of curious when it comes to the government. Like, are they sort of truly incentivized to try and stamp this out, or, as you said, the government collusion? Are they also somewhat incentivized to sort of keep the drug smuggling in terms of strengthening their economy? How's that sort of back and forth there?
So that's also the tricky thing, because there is some collusion going on, had been in the South. So just because the government says they want to stamp it out doesn't mean it's that easy, because the government is made up of people who may have various stakes in this industry. So what does the government want? I would hope, and I think that lessons have been learned, that whatever you think about drug smuggling and its capacity for personal enrichment, it is quite literally explosive when you drop it into a social network, in ways that initially maybe they saw as beneficial in the short term because the sort of divide and rule strategy. But I think that has gotten quite out of hand at this point, we can say. So a lot of it may be a bit buyer's remorse and lessons that need to be made from the Malian government, that messing with sort of the local political structures and socioeconomic equilibriums is a very messy game that they may be quite careful about in the future.
Right. And so, through the research, what do you think for you has been, potentially either surprising or something you weren't really expecting to find that you did find, and sort of shocked you or interested you a little bit?
This area of my findings that I do find really, really interesting, that I think goes against a lot of what the previous research would expect around the varying effects of economic versus social factors in armed group dynamics, is that you do see a lot of cross-ethnic, cross-group cooperation and alliance building that's really based off of economic interests and economic function. So demographically in the north of Mali, it's primarily the Tuareg and the Arabs. And each sort of have similar sort of, I don't want to say feudal because that's contested, sort of types of internal social hierarchies that are broadly similar. They consider themselves the nobility, and the Tuareg and Arab nobility have been sort of cooperating together in a lot of ways throughout this conflict to try to maintain the socioeconomic system that predated the introduction of drug smuggling. And that is something that if you've dove into the literature on the economics of civil war and the economic dynamics of armed groups, that's something that is very, very interesting. and something that is quite I think a very interesting finding that could really make people rethink a lot of things and ask a lot of
Right.
new questions.
Because I guess it sort of questions the dynamics between which one comes first, whether it's the social cohesion or the economic incentives to work together, right? That's sort of an
Yeah, they're very
interesting point.
much, it's, a lot of times in economic literature, it's one or the other, or which direction does the causal arrow go? Is it a socially cohesive group that allows them to benefit from a type of economic activity, or is it the type of economic activity that promotes social cohesion? It's sort of a chicken and the egg type thing, but
Yeah.
it really is just sort of it's a sort of mutually reinforcing system. That's why we use the term socioeconomic system, because it is
Yeah.
a sort of intertwined system. They're not two separate spheres of life that occasionally intersect.
hmm For sure. And how do you think sort of learning about this sort of intersection, how can that perhaps help people think about other conflicts or, in general, just sort of help them think through, I don't know, more contemporary or other facets of their life, I
Yeah,
suppose.
that's a great question, and that's like big picture stuff, right? So that's a question of generalizability, applicability of my findings. I think at the lowest level, any sort of conflict that is sort of overlaid with areas of high levels of drug or migrant smuggling is you expect to see similar dynamics of sort of it was going to stress the socioeconomic structures. So primarily my research is on Mali, but you could also see similar dynamics in Libya and Niger. But broader picture, even broader picture, this is a story about how economic change, particularly rapid, severe economic change, really has very immediate, acute social consequences. And that's the story of globalization. That's something that we see in our politics today, all across the world. So, again, just sort of big picture stuff is saying, keep, understanding that as this sort of economic turmoil churns on across the world, globalization, rise of technology, the introduction of new resources and new industries in certain areas. I've never seen that before. This is going to have very severe social consequences, which we sort of know at the abstract level, right? But sort of what are the specifics of these social consequences, what those are going to be, you need to look into, okay, so what are the socioeconomic hierarchies now? Who's at the top, who's the political power in this area? It's usually, those that, at the top of the social hierarchy, and they have a sort of control over resources. Well, this new resource is coming in. Are they going to be able to control that resource? If not, who is? And what's the effect of that going to be on the sort of prevailing power structures?
Right.
And you're often going to find it's going to undermine those power structures. And what happens when those power structures get undermined? You get things like civil wars, rebellions, etc. Not to be like cynical and like not saying that there's we're moving into a really messy era in world history, but it's something to look out for, and it can add a lot of context to disorder and instability in a lot of areas.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's probably a good place to end it there. That's a good way to sort of cap it off, sort of the big picture way to think about it. So Thomas, yeah, thank you again for your time and for the conversation and learning more about your research. Thank you.
Yeah, Sean, thank you. Appreciated it.